They said his silence was more dangerous than a loaded gun. Lorenzo Blackwood, the man who built an empire on steel and fear. In New York's most exclusive restaurant, not even the senator dining at table 4 dared to look him in the eye. But then there was Clara, a 23-year-old waitress with holes in her shoes and a secret buried in her past. She wasn't supposed to speak. She wasn't even supposed to be there. But when she saw the pain hidden behind the old man's cold stare, she broke the golden rule. She leaned in and whispered one single Italian word. One word that didn't just stop the dinner, it stopped the world. And what happened next? It brought the billionaire dynasty to its knees. If you wanted to disappear in Manhattan, you didn't go to the slums. You went to Loven, the restaurant on 57th Street, where the lighting was so dim and the clientele so wealthy that the staff were treated less like humans and more like sentient furniture. Clara adjusted her apron, her fingers trembling slightly as she smoothed the stark white fabric over her waist. Her shoes, cheap knockoffs of the required uniform loafers, pinched her toes. She had been on her feet for 9 hours, but she couldn't afford to feel the pain. Rent was due in 3 days, and her mother's medical bills in Ohio were piling up like snowdrifts against a door she could no longer keep closed. "Table 1 is arriving in 5 minutes, the maitre d', a sharp-featured Frenchman named Henri, hissed into his headset. He looked at the waitstaff lined up by the kitchen pass, like a general inspecting troops before a suicide mission. "Listen to me clearly. You do not speak unless spoken to. You do not offer specials. You do not ask how the water is. You pour, you place, you vanish. Is that understood?" "Yes, chef," the staff murmured in unison. Though Henry wasn't a chef, he just liked the power of the title. Clara swallowed hard. Table 1, the Blackwood table. Everyone knew the Blackwoods. Adrian Blackwood was currently the most eligible bachelor on the East Coast, a tech mogul who had successfully transitioned his father's industrial money into Silicon Valley gold. He was 32, ruthlessly handsome, and had a reputation for firing staff for breathing too loudly. But it wasn't Adrian that made the staff sweat. It was his father, Lorenzo Blackwood, 80 years old. The patriarch, rumors swirled around him like smoke. They said he hadn't spoken a kind word since his wife died 20 years ago. They said he once bought a hotel chain just to fire a valet who scratched his car. He was a man made of old-world grit and new-world cruelty. "Clara," Henry snapped, making her jump. "You're on water and bread service for table 1. Do not mess this up. If I see a single drop on the tablecloth, you're out. Tonight." "I won't let you down, Henri," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't care about you letting me down," Henri sneered, adjusting his cuffs. "I care about my bonus. Now, go." The double doors of the restaurant swung open. The air in the room seemed to change, the oxygen sucked out by the sheer gravity of the men entering. First came the bodyguards, sweeping the room with eyes that missed nothing. Then Adrian Blackwood, looking every inch the billionaire in a bespoke navy suit, talking rapidly into an earpiece that he pulled out just as he crossed the threshold. And then Lorenzo. He was in a wheelchair, pushed by a stone-faced nurse. He wore a tuxedo that looked like it was from another era, immaculate and severe. His face was a map of deep lines and sun-damaged skin, his eyes dark and watery, staring straight ahead at nothing. He looked like a king who had conquered the world only to realize he hated the view. The restaurant fell silent. Even the clinking of silverware stopped. This was the power of the Blackwoods. Clara rushed to the side station, grabbing the heavy crystal pitcher. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Just pour the water," she told herself. "Just pour the water and vanish." As the group settled at the prime table in the corner, secluded by velvet ropes, Clara approached. She could smell the expensive cologne radiating off Adrian, a scent of sandalwood and cold cash. Lorenzo smelled differently. He smelled of old paper and peppermint. "Father, please," Adrian was saying, his voice tight with suppressed frustration. "The board needs a decision on the merger by Monday. You can't keep stalling." Lorenzo didn't blink. He stared at the empty white plate in front of him, as if it were an abyss. "I am not stalling," Lorenzo rasped. His voice sounded like gravel grinding together. "I am thinking." "You've been thinking for 6 months," Adrian shot back, snapping his napkin onto his lap. "You're jeopardizing the legacy." Clara stepped forward, the pitcher heavy in her hand. She moved to Lorenzo's right side, executing the pour perfectly. The water cascaded silently into the crystal goblet. Lorenzo's hand twitched. He didn't look at her, but he spoke to the room. "The water is too cold." Clara froze. The ice clinked softly. Adrian sighed, rubbing his temples. "Father, it's water. Drink it." "It hurts my teeth," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "They bring me ice when I have old bones. No one thinks. Incompetence." Henri was already rushing over, his face pale. "My deepest apologies, Mr. Blackwood. I will replace it immediately. Clara, move." He shoved her aside, not gently. Clara stumbled, barely keeping her balance, clutching the pitcher. She felt the heat rising in her cheeks. She was invisible, yet somehow she was the problem. As she retreated to the shadows of the service station, she watched them. The son, obsessed with the future. The father, trapped in a body that was failing him, surrounded by luxury he seemed to despise. It was going to be a long night. By 9 p.m., the tension at table 1 was thick enough to choke on. The chef, a temperamental genius named Marco, had sent out 3 courses. The amuse-bouche, a delicate foam of scallops and truffle. The appetizer, foie gras with a fig reduction. The pasta, lobster ravioli with saffron cream. Lorenzo Blackwood hadn't taken a single bite. The plates were returned to the kitchen full, which sent Chef Marco into a spiraling rage. "He insults me!" Marco shouted, throwing a tasting spoon across the stainless steel counter. "This is the finest menu in New York. Does he want a hot dog? Is that what he wants?" "He's old, Chef," Clara ventured softly from the pickup window, waiting for the breadbasket refill. "Maybe he's not hungry." "You don't speak about the guest," Marco barked at her. "Take the bread. Go." Clara hurried back out. The dining room was buzzing, but a zone of silence still surrounded table 1. Adrian was eating, but he was angry. He was cutting his steak with aggressive strokes, the knife screeching slightly against the porcelain. "You have to eat something, Dad," Adrian said, not looking up. "The nurse says your weight is down again." "The food tastes like metal," Lorenzo grumbled. He was picking at the linen tablecloth with a gnarled finger, unraveling a loose thread. "It has no soul. It's plastic food for plastic people." "This is a 3 Michelin star restaurant," Adrian hissed. "Stop being difficult just to punish me." "I don't need to punish you," Lorenzo said, finally looking at his son. The old man's eyes were sharp, lucid, and filled with a profound disappointment. "You punish yourself enough with your greed." Adrian dropped his fork. It clamoured loudly onto the plate. Several heads turned. "I am securing our future," Adrian said, his voice trembling with rage. "I am trying to keep the name Blackwood relevant while you sit here and rot." The insult hung in the air. The nurse looked away, embarrassed. Lorenzo didn't yell. He just shrank a little. He slumped in his wheelchair, the fight draining out of him. He looked suddenly incredibly small. He looked like a man who wanted to go home, but didn't know where home was anymore. Clara approached with the bread basket. It was an artisan sourdough, crusty and warm, served with cultured butter. She placed it on the table. Lorenzo looked at the bread. He reached out a shaking hand and touched the crust. He didn't take a piece. He just felt the texture of it. too hard," he whispered. "Everything is too hard." Clara paused. She was supposed to walk away. Henri was watching her from the podium like a hawk. But something in Lorenzo's voice stopped her. It wasn't just the complaint of a grumpy billionaire. It was the tone. It was the specific cadence of a man who was speaking English, but thinking in another language. Clara looked at his hands. They were calloused, despite decades of wealth. Those were working hands. She remembered reading in a tabloid that Lorenzo Blackwood hadn't been born rich. He had come over on a boat in the 1950s, a devastatingly poor immigrant who worked in steel mills before buying them. She looked at the untouched fancy food. She looked at the sourdough bread. And then she remembered her own grandfather, Nonno Pietro. He had been a carpenter in Ohio. When he got old and the dementia started to set in, he stopped eating the hospital food. He said it tasted like nothing. Clara realized what was happening. Lorenzo wasn't being difficult. He was homesick. He was starving for a memory. She shouldn't do it. If she spoke, she would be fired. Henri was looking right at her. She needed this job. She needed the tips. But looking at the old man, seeing the sheer loneliness in his eyes, Clara felt her heart break. She took a step closer, breaking the invisible barrier. Adrian looked up, annoyed. "What is it? We didn't ask for anything." Clara ignored him. She ignored the billionaire. She ignored the nurse. She looked directly at Lorenzo Blackwood. She leaned down, breaching the protocol distance, until her face was level with his. The room seemed to stop. Henri started speed walking toward the table, his eyes wide with panic. Clara took a breath. She looked at the bread, then at Lorenzo, and she whispered the word. "Scarpetta." She said it softly, with a perfect, rolling Italian accent. It wasn't just a word. It was an invitation. Lorenzo's head snapped up. For the first time all night, his eyes focused completely. He looked at Clara, really looked at her. "What did you say?" he rasped. Henri arrived at the table, breathless. "Mr. Blackwood, I am so sorry. This waitress is new. She is leaving immediately." He reached out to grab Clara's arm. Lorenzo raised a hand. "Stop." The command was absolute. Henri froze, his hand hovering inches from Clara's elbow. Lorenzo turned his gaze back to Clara. His eyes were wide, searching her face. "Say it again." Clara ignored the trembling in her knees. She ignored the furious glare Adrian was shooting her. She smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Fare la scarpetta," she whispered. It literally meant, "make the little shoe." It was an Italian idiom for taking a piece of bread and using it to mop up the last of the tomato sauce on your plate. It was something you did at home, in the kitchen, with your family. It was rude in high society. It was considered peasant behavior. But to an Italian who grew up with nothing, it was the best part of the meal. It was the taste of comfort. Lorenzo stared at her. His mouth opened slightly. The mask of the angry billionaire cracked, and underneath, the face of the immigrant boy peered through. "My mother," Lorenzo whispered. She used to say, "If you don't do the scarpetta, the chef will cry." "Because the sauce is the soul," Clara finished for him, quoting an old proverb her nonno used to say. Lorenzo's eyes filled with tears. Actual tears. Adrian looked between them, totally confused. "What is going on? What did she say to you?" Lorenzo ignored his son. He pointed a shaking finger at the fancy lobster ravioli that had been sitting cold on the table. This is not food. This is art. I cannot eat art." He looked at Clara. "Do they have sugo? Real sugo?" Clara knew the menu. There was no simple tomato sauce. There were reductions, foams, and glazes. "I can ask the kitchen," Clara said softly. "But I think I know what you need." She turned to Henri. who looked like he was having a stroke. "Henri," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Ask Marco for a bowl of plain spaghetti, al dente, olive oil, and a side of the marinara he makes for the staff meal. Not the customer sauce, the staff sauce." "Are you insane?" Henri hissed. "We cannot serve staff food to table 1. "Do it!" Lorenzo roared. The sound echoed off the mahogany walls. The entire restaurant jumped. "Do as she says!" Lorenzo slammed his hand on the table. "And bring me bread, soft bread, not this rock." Henri turned on his heel and sprinted toward the kitchen. For the next 10 minutes, the restaurant remained in a state of suspended animation. Adrian sat in stunned silence, watching his father. Lorenzo was watching Clara. "Where are you from?" Lorenzo asked her. His voice wasn't gravel anymore. It was lighter. "Ohio," Clara said. "But my family, we are from Abruzzo." "Abruzzo," Lorenzo nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Hard land. Strong people." "Stubborn people," Clara corrected with a smile. Lorenzo let out a sound that shocked everyone. A laugh. It was a rusty, dry sound, but it was a laugh. "See, stubborn." When Henri returned, he was carrying a simple white bowl. Inside was spaghetti, coated in a bright, oily red sauce, the simple garlic and tomato sauce the dishwasher's mother made for the staff before service. It smelled of basil and home. He placed it in front of Lorenzo. Clara took a piece of soft Italian roll from a different basket she had raided from the back. She placed it next to the bowl. Lorenzo didn't wait for the silverware. He picked up the fork, twirled a massive bite, and shoved it into his mouth. Sauce got on his chin. He didn't care. He chewed, closed his eyes, and swallowed. Then he took the bread. He wiped the bowl. Scarpetta. He ate the bread. "Adrian," Lorenzo said, his mouth full. "Yes, father?" Adrian sounded terrified. "This is good. Taste it." Adrian blinked. He looked at the cheap pasta. He looked at the waitress who had just orchestrated a coup in the middle of a 3-star dinner. I'm okay, Dad." Lorenzo turned to Clara. "What is your name?" "Clara. Clara Ricci." "Ricci," Lorenzo nodded. He wiped his mouth with the linen napkin, staining it bright red. "Clara Ricci, you are the first person in 5 years who has looked at me and seen a man, not a bank account." He reached into his tuxedo pocket. "Dad, don't," Adrian warned, thinking he was reaching for his wallet to give a tip. "We handle the gratuity digitally." Lorenzo pulled out a small, battered leather notebook. He opened it to a blank page. He scribbled something on it with a gold pen. He tore the page out. He handed it to Clara. "If you ever get tired of carrying water for idiots," Lorenzo said, glancing at Henri, "call this number. Ask for Beatrice. Tell her you know what Scarpetta means." Clara took the paper. It was a phone number and a name. "Thank you, signore," she whispered. Lorenzo turned back to his pasta. He ate the whole bowl. The dinner finished. The Callaways left. As soon as the doors closed, Henri marched up to Clara. His face was purple. "You think you are smart?" Henri spat. "You think because the old man liked your little stunt, you are safe?" "He ate," Clara said. "He hasn't eaten in months, Henri. You humiliated the chef. You humiliated me. You served garbage to a billionaire." Henri ripped the apron off her waist. "Get out. You're fired. Don't bother clocking out." Clara stood there, the apron in her hand. The noise of the kitchen roared behind her. She had saved the dinner, and she had lost her job. She looked at the piece of paper in her hand. She walked out into the cold New York night, the paper clenched in her fist. She didn't know it yet, but that piece of paper was a key, and she had just unlocked a door that had been sealed for 50 years. But inside the restaurant, Adrian Blackwood was still sitting at the table, long after his father had been wheeled out. He was looking at the empty chair where Clara had stood. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Run a background check," Adrian said, his voice cold. "Clara Ricci. Find out who she is. Find out everything. My father just gave her access to the private line. I want to know if she's a hustler or a spy." He paused, looking at the crumbs of bread left on his father's plate. "And find out why the hell my father looked at her like he recognized her." 72 hours later, Clara was staring at a bright orange eviction notice taped to the peeling paint of her apartment door in Queens. Henry hadn't just fired her, he had blacklisted her. In the tight-knit world of high-end Manhattan dining, word travelled faster than a grease fire. She had insulted a VVIP. 2 interviews she'd managed to secure were cancelled via text message before she even arrived. Inside her tiny apartment, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and mounting panic. Her phone buzzed on the cheap laminate counter. It was the collection agency for her mother's Ohio hospital bills. Again. Clara let it go to voicemail. She sank onto her futon, putting her head in her hands. The adrenaline of that night at Loven had faded, leaving behind a crushing reality. She had stood up for humanity, and humanity had rewarded her by taking away her livelihood. Her eyes drifted to the small, wobbly coffee table. Sitting there, anchored by a lukewarm mug of tea, was the torn page from Lorenzo Blackwood's notebook. Beatrice. And a number. It felt insane. Lorenzo Blackwood was a man known for crushing unions and bankrupting rivals. He wasn't a savior. That moment in the restaurant, it had to be a fluke. A senile whim brought on by low blood sugar. If she called that number, she was terrified of what would happen. Best case scenario? A humiliating rejection by some high-powered executive assistant. Worst case? Adrian Blackwood decided she was trying to exploit his father and unleashed his lawyers on her. The phone buzzed again. Another collection call. Clara grabbed the piece of paper. Her hand was shaking so badly she misdialed the first time. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and punched the numbers in again. It rang twice. Blackwood Residence, private office. This is Beatrice Vance speaking. The voice was intimidating, crisp, precise, with a mid-Atlantic accent that sounded like money and old movies. It wasn't the voice of a secretary. It was the voice of a gatekeeper. "Hello," Clara stammered, her throat tight. "My name is Clara Ricci. I met Mr. Lorenzo Blackwood a few nights ago at Loven. He gave me this number." Silence stretched on the line. Clara could hear the faint scratching of a pen on paper. "Clara Ricci," Beatrice repeated, tasting the name. "The waitress with the scarpetta." Clara froze. "Yes, that's me." "Mr. Blackwood has been expecting your call for 2 days, Miss Ricci. He was beginning to think you had more sense than to get involved with this family." I almost didn't," Clara admitted. "But you're desperate," Beatrice stated, not unkindly. It was just a fact. "Henry at Loven is a vindictive little weasel. We assumed he would fire you." Clara felt a spark of anger. "You assumed? And you didn't do anything?" "We were waiting to see if you had the courage to call," Beatrice said smoothly. "Lorenzo doesn't hire cowards. Can you be at the estate in Oyster Bay by 2 p.m. today?" "The estate?" I thought this might be for a job at one of his other restaurants." Beatrice let out a short, sharp laugh, eerily similar to the one Lorenzo had given in the restaurant. "My dear girl, Lorenzo Blackwood hasn't cared about restaurants in 30 years. He doesn't want a waitress. He wants a memory. 2 p.m. Don't be late. The gate code is 1923. The line went dead. Clara spent her last $40 on a train ticket to Long Island and a cab from the station to the Blackwood estate. The estate was terrifying. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress built of grey stone, looming over the Long Island Sound. High iron gates swung open silently. When the cab driver punched in the code, the driveway was a mile long, lined with ancient oak trees that seemed to lean in, whispering warnings. When Clara stepped out of the cab, she felt incredibly small. Her clothes, clean black slacks and a sensible grey sweater, felt cheap against the backdrop of manicured lawns and towering architecture. The massive front door opened before she could knock. Standing there was a woman who looked like she was carved from the same granite as the house. Beatrice Vance was perhaps 70, tall and imposing, with steel grey hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a tailored wool suit that probably cost more than Clara's car back in Ohio. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and assessed Clara from head to toe in a microsecond. "You're thinner than you look on camera," Beatrice said by way of greeting. "On camera?" Clara asked, bewildered. "The restaurant security footage. Adrian had it pulled within an hour of you leaving. Come inside, Miss Ricci. We have much to discuss before the wolf arrives." "The wolf?" "Adrian," Beatrice said dryly, stepping aside to let Clara enter the cavernous marble foyer. "He thinks he runs this place. He runs the business. I run Lorenzo. There is a significant difference." Beatrice led Clara not to an office, but to a vast, sterile library that smelled like leather bindings and disuse. She gestured for Clara to sit in a wing-back chair that felt designed to make the occupant feel inferior. "Let's be clear, Miss Ricci," Beatrice began, standing by a cold fireplace. "Lorenzo is dying, not quickly, which is a mercy, but slowly, which is a torture. His body is giving up, but his mind is trapped in a loop of regret and nostalgia. Adrian, his son, believes the solution is to medicate him into compliance and keep him alive long enough to secure the next quarter's earnings." Clara listened, mesmerized by Beatrice's bluntness. "What Adrian fails to understand," Beatrice continued, her eyes narrowing, "is that his father is starving to death in a room full of food. Spiritual starvation. That performance at the restaurant? That was the first time in 5 years I've seen the real Lorenzo peek through the fog." "I just gave him spaghetti," Clara whispered. "You gave him permission to be human," Beatrice corrected. "Lorenzo wants to hire you, not as staff. He has enough staff who fear him. He wants a companion, someone who speaks his language, and I don't just mean Italian, someone who understands that a tomato is more than just an ingredient. What would I have to do? Be there, talk to him, argue with him, if you must, cook for him, real food, not that French nonsense. Make him remember why he fought so hard to build all this in the first place." Beatrice paused. "The pay is $150,000 a year, plus room and board here at the estate. Full benefits for you and your mother. We know about her condition. We own the insurance company that keeps denying her claims." Clara felt sick. The amount of money was staggering. It solved everything. But the manipulation made her skin crawl. "You own the insurance company?" "Adrian does," Beatrice clarified with a look of distaste. "Leverage is his preferred currency." Before Clara could process the offer, the heavy oak doors of the library slammed open. Adrian Blackwood strode in. He looked different than he had at the restaurant. There he had been annoyed. Here, on his home turf, he was predatory. His eyes were cold blue fire, and his jaw was set in a hard line. He held a manila folder in his hand. "Get out, Beatrice," Adrian snarled, not looking at the older woman. His eyes were fixed on Clara like laser sights. Beatrice didn't flinch. "I am conducting an interview at your father's request, Adrian." "Mind your manners." "My father is mentally compromised, and you are enabling a grifter." Adrian threw the folder onto the small table in front of Clara. Photos spilled out. Clara looked down. They were photos of her. leaving her apartment, walking into the pawn shop yesterday to sell her grandmother's ring, a photo of her mother, frail and hooked up to dialysis machines in Ohio, a copy of her father's death certificate from a factory accident 10 years ago, showing the subsequent debts he left behind. Clara Ricci, Adrian recited, his voice dripping with disdain. 23, college dropout. Father died owing the bank $80,000. Mother has end-stage renal failure. You are currently 3 months behind on rent, and you just pawned a gold ring for $200. You are drowning, Miss Ricci. And you saw my father as a life raft. Clara felt violated. Every secret pain she owned was spread out on the mahogany table. Tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She stood up, facing the billionaire. I didn't know who he was when I served him, Clara said, her voice trembling with fury. I saw an old man who was sad, something you've probably never bothered to notice. Adrian laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Spare me the bleeding heart routine. Everyone wants something from the Blackwoods. You found his weak spot, his sentimental streak for the old country. It was a good con. Clever. He pulled a checkbook from his inside jacket pocket. He uncapped a fountain pen. $50,000, Adrian said, writing quickly. Cash, today. You take it, you walk out that door, and you never speak to my father again. You use it to help your mother get back on your feet. It's more than you'll make in 2 years of serving pasta. He ripped the check out and held it towards her. It was a lifeline. It was freedom from fear for the first time in years. Clara looked at the check. Then she looked at Adrian's smug, victorious face. He thought everyone and everything could be bought. He looked at her the same way he had looked at the lobster ravioli, an object to be consumed or discarded based on its utility. Then she thought of Lorenzo's eyes when he ate the bread, the look of a man who had been seen for the first time in decades. If she took this money, she was agreeing with Adrian that the moment meant nothing, that it was just a transaction. Clara reached out and took the check. Adrian smirked. Slowly, deliberately, Clara tore the check in half, then in quarters. She let the pieces flutter onto the expensive Persian rug. Adrian's face went blank with shock. His smirk vanished. You can't buy Scarpetta, Mr. Blackwood, Clara said quietly. And you can't buy me. She turned to Beatrice, who was watching the scene with a look of profound satisfaction. When do I start? Clara asked. Adrian stepped forward, his physical presence menacing. You are making a massive mistake. You think you can survive in this house? I will chew you up and spit you out. You will wish you had stayed in Queens. Perhaps, Beatrice interjected coolly, stepping between them. But she is Lorenzo's guest now. And if you touch her, Adrian, I will tell your father exactly where you moved the Cayman assets last month. Adrian froze. The color drained from his face. He looked from Beatrice to Clara, realizing he had just lost a tactical skirmish he didn't even know he was fighting. Without another word, Adrian spun on his heel and stormed out of the library. Beatrice looked down at the torn check on the floor, then up at Clara. A genuine smile broke across her stern face, transforming it. Well done, Miss Ricci, Beatrice whispered. Welcome to the asylum. Now let's get you an apron. Lorenzo is asking for risotto. The first month at the Blackwood estate was a war of attrition. Adrian made good on his threat. He couldn't fire Clara, so he tried to break her. He had the staff ignore her. He ensured the heating in her assigned room in the East Wing was malfunctioning, leaving it freezing cold. He constantly filed complaints that her cooking was not nutritionally balanced for a man with Lorenzo's heart condition, sending expensive concierge doctors to lecture her. But Clara had grown up poor in Ohio. Cold rooms and judgmental authorities were nothing new. The real challenge was Lorenzo. He was a man entombed in his own bitterness. Some days he refused to leave his bed, staring at the ceiling, muttering in a dialect of Italian so old and localized, Clara could barely understand it. Other days, he would burst into rages, throwing things at the nurses Adrian hired, terrified of his own declining body. But Clara didn't treat him like a patient. She treated him like her nonno. When he raged, she yelled back in Italian, telling him to stop acting like a spoiled bambino. It shocked him into silence. When he sulked, she ignored him and started cooking in the small kitchenette adjacent to his suite. She didn't cook fancy food. She made pasta e fagioli, peasant soup with beans and pasta dregs. She made roasted chicken with rosemary potatoes that were slightly burnt on the edges, just the way the oven back in Abruzzo would do it. The smell was her weapon. It drifted under his door, a scent beacon calling him back to life. Slowly, miraculously, Lorenzo began to thaw. It started with small things. He would eat the soup. Then he agreed to sit in his wheelchair by the window while she prepped vegetables. By the third week, he was talking. "Adrian doesn't understand," Lorenzo rasped one rainy afternoon, watching Clara chop basil. "He sees steel. He sees silicon. He sees the deal. He never saw the fire." "The fire?" Clara asked softly. "The blast furnace." Lorenzo's eyes were distant. "When I first came here, 50 years ago, the heat, it melted the skin off your face. But we made the steel that built this city. We were giants. Now, I am a cripple in a golden cage." "You built the cage, Lorenzo," Clara said gently. He looked at her sharply, but didn't argue. "Maybe." But Adrian locked the door. He is ashamed of the steel, ashamed of the dirt under the fingernails. He wants everything clean, digital, sterile. He pointed a trembling finger at a portrait on the wall of a beautiful, austere woman. His mother. American royalty. Old money. She hated the smell of garlic on my breath. She tried to scrub the Italian out of me. Adrian is her son, not mine. It was a heartbreaking admission. The titan of industry felt completely alienated from his own legacy. As Lorenzo grew stronger, Adrian's panic grew palpable. Lorenzo was attending board meetings via video link again. He was countermanding Adrian's decisions. The stock price was wobbling because the market hated uncertainty. One evening, Clara was in the main kitchen, preparing a late-night snack of bruschetta for Lorenzo, when Adrian cornered her. The kitchen staff vanished instantly. "You're poisoning him," Adrian hissed, slamming his hand on the butcher block island. "His cholesterol is up. The doctors are furious." "He's happy, Adrian," Clara said calmly, not stopping her chopping. "For the first time in years, he's laughing. Isn't that worth a few cholesterol points?" "He's erratic. He cancelled the merger with Takamoto Industries yesterday. A $1 billion deal. Because he said the CEO didn't look him in the eye." Adrian leaned in close, his breath hot with scotch. "You are winding him up. You're whispering peasant nonsense in his ear and destroying this company." "I think he's just finally seeing clearly," Clara said. "Listen to me, you little gold digger." Adrian grabbed her wrist, hard. The knife fell from her hand with a clatter. "I know what you're doing. You think if you make him love you, he'll change the will. But I have power of attorney lined up. I will have him declared incompetent by the end of the week, and I will have you thrown out on the street with nothing. Get your hands off her." The voice was thunderous. Adrian dropped Clara's wrist as if burned. They both turned. Lorenzo was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. Standing. Not in his wheelchair. He was leaning heavily on a cane Beatrice held for him, shaking with effort. But he was upright. His eyes were blazing with the fury of the young man who used to work the blast furnaces. "Father," Adrian stammered, taking a step back. "You shouldn't be walking. The strain—" "Silence," Lorenzo commanded. The word cracked like a whip. He hobbled forward a few steps, Beatrice supporting him. He looked from his son to Clara. "You think she's here for my money?" Lorenzo asked Adrian, his voice low and dangerous. "Of course she is. Look at her. She's nothing." Lorenzo laughed. It was a terrifying sound. "Nothing?" Lorenzo shook his head. He looked at Clara, an intensity in his gaze that she didn't understand. It wasn't affection now. It was something deeper, something almost fearful. "You asked me once, Adrian, how I started," Lorenzo said. "How a boy with nothing but the shirt on his back bought his first steel mill." "You got a loan," Adrian said impatiently. "From a bank." "No bank would touch me," Lorenzo spat. "I spoke no English. I smelled of coal." He turned fully to Clara. "Tell me your father's name again," Lorenzo demanded. Clara was confused, rubbing her bruised wrist. "My father? His name was Antonio Ricci." Lorenzo nodded slowly. "And his father? Your grandfather?" Pietro Ricci." The name hit the room like a physical blow. Lorenzo closed his eyes, swaying slightly. Beatrice gripped his arm tighter to steady him. Even Adrian seemed confused by his father's reaction. "Pietro Ricci," Lorenzo whispered the name like a prayer and a curse. He opened his eyes and looked at Adrian. "You call her nothing, Adrian. But you are wrong. She owns this house. She owns the shirt on your back. She owns every beam of steel in every building we have ever built." Adrian looked completely lost. "What are you talking about? The dementia is getting worse." "It is not dementia. It is history," Lorenzo roared, slamming his cane against the tiled floor. 55 years ago, I was starving in a boarding house in Pittsburgh. I wanted to buy a share in a scrap metal yard. It cost $500. It was a fortune. Lorenzo looked at Clara, his eyes shimmering with 50 years of guilt. "Your grandfather, Pietro. He was a carpenter. The best I ever knew. He had saved $500 to buy his own shop. It took him 10 years to save it." Lorenzo's voice broke. "He saw my hunger. He saw my fire, and he gave me the money. All of it. He handed me his future so I could have mine." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Her nonno Pietro had died poor, working for other people until his back gave out. He never owned his own shop. "He made me promise," Lorenzo continued, tears spilling onto his weathered cheeks. He said, "Lorenzo, when you are rich, you pay me back, with interest." We shook hands, Scarpetta style, man to man. 2 years later, I made my first $1 million. I went back to find him. He was gone. Moved to Ohio, they said. I hired detectives. For 20 years I looked. But Ricci, it is a common name. I never found him. I built an empire on a stolen dream. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. The only sound was the hum of the industrial refrigerators. "When I heard your name at the restaurant," Lorenzo whispered to Clara, "when I saw your eyes, you have his eyes. Pietro's eyes, I knew. The debt had finally come due." Lorenzo turned to his son, who was pale as a ghost. "You want to declare me incompetent, Adrian? Go ahead. But know this. Tomorrow morning, I am calling a full press conference. I am announcing the formation of the Ricci Blackwood Trust. 51% of all my voting shares will be placed into it." Adrian looked like he was going to vomit. 51%? That's control of the company. Dad, you can't. "It is done," Lorenzo said. He looked at Beatrice. "Beatrice has the paperwork ready. And guess who will be the co-trustees?" Lorenzo pointed his cane at Clara. "Beatrice Vance and Clara Ricci." The boardroom on the 50th floor of the Blackwood Tower was less a room and more a glass cage suspended in the clouds. It was designed to intimidate. The table was a 20-foot slab of polished obsidian that looked like a frozen oil slick. The chairs were aeronautical leather. The view was a panoramic sweep of Manhattan, a kingdom of steel and ambition that Lorenzo Blackwood had conquered, brick by bloody brick. Today, however, the atmosphere wasn't one of conquest. It was a funeral wake for the old regime. 12 men and 3 women, sat around the table. These were the titans of finance, the board of directors, people who moved markets with a whisper. They were silent now, nervously checking their watches or smoothing invisible wrinkles on their bespoke suits. They had been summoned for an emergency session at 9 a.m. sharp, with no agenda provided. At the head of the table sat the empty seat usually reserved for Adrian. To the right of it sat Beatrice Vance. She was reading a financial report with the casual indifference of someone reading a lunch menu. To the left sat Clara Ricci. Clara kept her hands folded in her lap to hide the fact that they were shaking. Beatrice had dressed her in a tailored navy blazer and charcoal trousers. Armor, she had called it. But Clara felt like an imposter. She was a waitress who knew how to balance 4 plates on one arm, not a corporate raider who understood stock options. She looked at the city below, feeling the vertigo of her sudden ascent. What am I doing here? She thought. I should be clocking in for the lunch shift. The heavy double doors hissed open. The room collectively held its breath. Adrian walked in first. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in 3 days. His tie was slightly askew, his eyes rimmed with red. He walked to the head of the table, placed his hands on the back of the chairman's chair, and looked ready to speak. But then, the sound of a motorized hum filled the room. Lorenzo Blackwood rolled in. He wasn't wearing the pajamas or the robe he had lived in for years. He was wearing a 3-piece charcoal suit cut from vintage Italian wool. It was a suit from the 1970s, a little loose on his frame now, but it carried the weight of history. He didn't look frail. He looked like a retired general returning to the front lines. "Sit down, Adrian," Lorenzo said. His voice wasn't a rasp anymore. It was a low rumble, amplified by the perfect acoustics of the room. "Father, I am the CEO," Adrian said, his voice cracking. "I chair this meeting." "You sit." Lorenzo pointed a gnarled finger to a chair at the far end of the table, the seat usually reserved for the junior secretary taking minutes. "Or you leave. Permanently." The silence was deafening. Adrian stared at his father, his jaw working. He looked at the board members for support, but they all found the grain of the table fascinating. Defeated, Adrian walked the length of the obsidian slab and sat in the small chair. Lorenzo wheeled himself to the head of the table. He didn't smile. He looked at each board member, locking eyes with them one by one. "You all think I am crazy," Lorenzo began. "It wasn't a question. You have been whispering. The old man is losing it. He is being manipulated by the help. He is senile." He slammed a thick, leather-bound ledger onto the table. Dust motes danced in the air. "This is not senility," Lorenzo growled. "This is accounting." He gestured to Clara. "Stand up, Miss Ricci." Clara stood, her legs feeling like jelly. Every eye in the room bored into her. "This is Clara Ricci," Lorenzo announced. "Many of you know her as the woman who served you water at Loven 3 weeks ago. You didn't look at her face then. I suggest you look at it now." "Lorenzo, with all due respect," a board member named Sterling interrupted. "We have a quarterly earnings call in 2 days. The market is jittery. Why is a waitress in a closed-door session?" "Because she is the largest creditor of this company," Lorenzo shot back. Sterling blinked. "Excuse me?" 55 years ago, Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a storytelling cadence that held the room captive. "I was 25 years old. I had an idea for a new way to smelt recycled steel. It was cheaper, faster, and dirtier than what the big mills were doing. I needed capital. I went to every bank in this city. They laughed at my accent. They laughed at my clothes." Lorenzo looked at Clara. "I was living in a boarding house in Queens. There was a man in the room next to mine. Pietro Ricci, a carpenter. He worked 14 hours a day, sanding floors until his fingers bled. He was saving money to bring his wife over from Abruzzo. He had $500 hidden in a tin can under his floorboards. In 1955, that was a fortune. That was a house. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She had never known this part of the story. One night I was crying in the hallway, Lorenzo admitted, shocking the room. I was ready to give up and go back to Italy. Pietro came out. He asked me what was wrong. I told him about the steel. I told him about the future I could see but couldn't touch. Lorenzo paused, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the ledger. He didn't ask for a business plan. He didn't ask for collateral. He went into his room, dug up the tin can, and poured the money into my hands. He said, "Lorenzo, you have the fire. Go make the fire work for us." We shook hands. He said, "Pay me back when you are a king." Lorenzo turned to Sterling. "I took that money. I bought the scrapyard. I built the first mill. I made the first 1,000,000, then 10, then 1,000,000,000. But when I went back to find Pietro, he was gone. I hired detectives," Lorenzo continued, his voice thick with regret. "But Ricci is a common name. I lost him. For 50 years I have been a thief. I built this tower on stolen money." He turned to Clara. "Your grandfather never got his shop, did he?" "No," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. He worked construction. He fell from a scaffold in 82. He died broke." A gasp went through the room. "Broke," Lorenzo repeated, the word hanging like a guillotine. "While I flew on private jets, while Adrian bought yachts." Lorenzo turned back to the board. His eyes were hard as diamonds. "The debt is due, with interest, compound interest." Beatrice stood up then, sliding a stack of legal documents down the center of the table. "As of 8 a.m. this morning," Beatrice stated, her voice crisp and lethal, "Mr. Blackwood has transferred 51% of his voting shares into a newly formed entity, the Ricci Blackwood Trust. The beneficiaries are the descendants of Pietro Ricci. The trustees with full voting power are myself and Miss Clara Ricci." The room erupted. Shout, protests, questions about legality. Adrian stood up, his face purple. "You can't do this. You're handing the company to a stranger. She's a waitress." "She is the owner," Lorenzo roared, silencing the room. "And you, Adrian, are an employee, and you are failing." Lorenzo wheeled himself down the length of the table toward his son. "You wanted to declare me incompetent because I wanted to eat pasta," Lorenzo said quietly to Adrian. "You wanted to erase where we came from because it embarrassed you. You cut the quality of the steel to save pennies. You treated people like machines." Lorenzo stopped inches from Adrian. "I am not firing you, Adrian. That would be too easy. You will remain CEO." Adrian looked confused. I will? Yes. But you will have no vote. You will answer to the trust. You will answer to Clara. You will relearn this business from the ground up. You will visit the mills. You will talk to the workers. You will learn what it smells like when iron melts." Lorenzo turned his chair to face Clara again. "And you, my dear," he said softly. "The lawyers have already wired the funds to the hospital in Cleveland. Your mother is being airlifted there as we speak. The transplant team is waiting." Clara couldn't hold it back anymore. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed. It wasn't polite, corporate crying. It was the raw release of years of terror and poverty dissolving in an instant. Lorenzo waited for her to compose herself. Then he reached into the pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a small Tupperware container. The board members watched in bewildered silence as the billionaire opened the plastic lid. Inside was a rich, red tomato sauce. He placed it on the obsidian table. Next to it, he placed a chunk of crusty bread. "Adrian," Lorenzo said. "Yes, father?" Adrian sounded small, broken, but listening. "Come here." Adrian walked over. He looked at the bread. He looked at the sauce. He looked at Clara, who was wiping her eyes, looking back at him, not with triumph, but with a strange, tired empathy. "We have a rule in this family," Lorenzo said, his voice echoing in the silent boardroom. "We do not waste the source. The source is the soul. You have forgotten the soul, Adrian." Lorenzo pointed to the bread. "Make the scarpetta." Adrian hesitated. He looked at the board members, the people he had tried so hard to impress with his cold ruthlessness. Then he looked at his father, the man he thought he had lost to dementia, only to find he was the only one who was truly awake. Adrian reached out. His manicured hand took the rough piece of bread. He dipped it into the sauce. He didn't do it delicately. He swiped it through the container, scooping up the red gold, staining his fingertips. He ate it. He chewed slowly. The taste was acidic, sweet, garlicky. It tasted like a kitchen he hadn't visited since he was a child. It tasted like a memory he had repressed. Adrian swallowed. He looked at Clara. "It's good," Adrian whispered. "It's from the staff meal," Clara said, her voice steady. "Chef Marco made it this morning." Adrian nodded. He took another piece of bread. "Meeting adjourned," Lorenzo announced, turning his wheelchair around. "Clara, Beatrice, we have work to do. I believe the steel mill in Pittsburgh needs a visit. I want to show Clara where her grandfather saved my life." As Lorenzo wheeled out, flanked by the formidable Beatrice and the waitress-turned-owner Clara, the board members remained seated, staring at the empty Tupperware container on the obsidian table. The empire had fallen, the family had returned, and in the silence of the skyscraper, the smell of garlic and tomatoes lingered, the scent of a promise finally kept. And so, the empire built on steel, and silence was saved by a bowl of spaghetti and a 50-year-old promise. Lorenzo Blackwood didn't just find an heir that day, he found his soul again. Clara Ricci didn't just find a fortune, she reclaimed her grandfather's legacy. It's a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a world of plastic and pretense is something real, something messy, like cleaning the plate with a piece of bread. If this story touched you, if you believe that courage and authenticity can still win in this world, please hit that like button. It really helps get these stories out there. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to change course. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Until next time, keep it real.